Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and how Creative Assembly could improve longer campaigns in the game, or at least make them less frustrating. I do believe that the campaign AI changes that they are working on will go a long way, because right now the campaign AI just doesn't work especially well in terms of building a massive empire and handling a war on a large scale. This is one of the problems with the endgame crises, because the AI does get to very powerful resources, powerful armies, free armies, research, etc. And in the case of the Chaos Dwarves, teleportation around the map or various armies around the map, but they're not capable of utilizing those resources well. And that is certainly a problem. It does feel that the AI decision-making on the campaign map is random. And we can also talk about confederation of various AI factions, Legendary Lord factions. But it is something that Creative Assembly does seem to be working on, so I won't talk too much about that. But hopefully they will tackle those issues about like the AI building powerful empires, having better decision-making, utilization of resources, building proper armies, and not just like, oh, we're just going to build an army of land ships. Because you can counter that. If you know the AI is going to do X, then you know how to counter X if you're aware that it is going to happen. So regardless of that, let's talk about certain other issues in the game that Creative Assembly should deal with. And one of the first things I feel should be talked about is campaign objectives, but not just victory conditions. See, victory conditions in Warhammer 3 are not especially great, because either you have victory conditions that give you a lot of flexibility around the campaign map, or you have victory conditions that force you to do the same thing over and over and over again. One of the problems for Karl Franz and Elspeth, it's always about taking over the Empire, for instance. In other campaigns, it's the same thing. Like High Elves want to deal with Dark Elves want to deal with High Elves. It creates a kind of campaign situation where you're always going to be doing the same thing. And it is also frustrating because certain campaign victory conditions are irrelevant. Others are exceptionally powerful, because getting free hero capacity for all heroes and 10 hero recruit rank is exceptionally strong. But instead of the current system, I think that Creative Assembly should take a page, or the whole damn book, from Total War Pharaoh, funnily enough. Because Total War Pharaoh does some things very, very well. Not all the things, but in terms of victory conditions, the way you win a campaign in that game is you have victory points. And the more victory points you get, the closer you are towards winning your campaign. So instead of the system of like, oh, you just need to take over 30 settlements and you get your short campaign, or your long campaign requires 60 settlements, instead of a system like that, we should have a more dynamic system that rewards you for doing different things, because that's what Total War Pharaoh does. It rewards you for taking territory, it rewards you for destroying certain factions, it rewards you for building an economy, it rewards you for building higher tier settlements, it rewards you for dealing with the unique campaign mechanics of the various ancient legacies. So that is something that Warhammer 3 could use. I imagine it would be a lot of work, especially to do it for every single race and every single faction, to give them that unique aspect, but overhauled victory conditions would make for a far more interesting campaign. Combine this with dynamic objectives throughout the campaign. Yes, you do get some dynamic objectives, but they do feel very lackluster in Warhammer 3 in a lot of ways. Whereas in Pharaoh, you get a lot of different objectives you can choose. Like, you get a choice of a short-term objective, a quest really. You get a choice, like, oh, which one am I going to focus on? Is it going to be a military one? Is it going to be an economic one? Those kind of things. Is it going to be conquering a certain territory or dealing with a certain foe? And you get different rewards dependent on the difficulty of it. Basically, what Total War Pharaoh has done is, by default, every single faction in Total War Pharaoh has a similar kind of system to what Axiatl has in his campaign, because Axiatl does have dynamic objectives in his campaign, which is one of the things that does help elevate his campaign compared to all the other Lizardmen combined. But that is something that is available by default for every faction, for every lord, if you will, in Total Warfare. And that is something that Creative Assembly could do for every single faction, every single legendary lord in Warhammer 3. Not obviously in the same way as Axiatl, but just the idea of dynamic objectives, rewards, choices would make things far, far more interesting. So it's a question of not just the objectives needed to win the campaign, but the kind of objectives that you're getting throughout the campaign that you can choose. Like, let's say I'm playing an Elspeth campaign, maybe I get an objective to deal with some of Vlad's armies or some of his territory. But then I can also choose an objective to deal with Festus, or deal with Gorbad, or Scrag, one way or another, or an economic objective, a development objective. Those things would be pretty good from my point of view. Another aspect to talk about beyond campaign objectives is the issue of climate. Climate is a significant limiting factor in Total War Warhammer. You can use mods to remove the climate penalties, but even that doesn't necessarily feel great, because it makes it meaningless to focus on certain territory when you know all territories are viable. There are some mods that do give you climate adaptation over time, but the timing of that makes it so that you're just spending a lot of time and effort still to make territory useful. You can make it useful, to be certain, in the long term, but it just takes a good amount of time with regards to that. So it's a balancing aspect with regards to some of those mods, but I do think that that's something that they're toying with regards to Kislev rework, and hopefully they're gonna take that idea and apply it on a wider scale in Warhammer 3, the idea of climate adaptation. Though, again, it does come down to how fast you can do it. Because if it's something like that takes 20 turns, forget about it. You're not going to make conquering a significant portion of the map suddenly much better if it's 20 turns to make a single province useful. Especially because of the way that provinces work. Maybe it would be better to have a system where you don't adapt a particular province to your climate, but rather your faction is adapting to that climate in general. So let's say, for instance, you're starting an Elspeth campaign, you start with the wasteland not being viable, but the more you spend in the wasteland, the more the wasteland climate as a whole becomes more viable to you. So the penalties of colonizing in the wasteland, they do suddenly become less and less and less. And one significant aspect with regards to climate, one thing that does hurt you a lot in terms of playing a long campaign, is not the growth or control or construction costs or anything like that, it's the casualty replenishment. When your casualty replenishment gets affected, it makes it less interesting to deal with that climate, because you know you're just going to have to wait to replenish any kind of casualties, especially if you're playing a faction that may not necessarily have the best casualty replenishment. Though, to be fair, most factions can improve their casualty replenishment by quite a bit. There's only a handful of exceptions, but it is just something worth pointing out. It is annoying, for instance, playing a campaign as Cafe and dealing with all the uninhabitable climate or unpleasant climate because of the casualty replenishment issue that Cafe has, for instance. So that is something that I feel Creative Assembly should tackle regards to climate. But regardless, it does seem that they're acknowledging that, at least with Kislev, but hopefully they acknowledge it on a wider scale for many more factions. So climate objectives. Then we have to talk about, like, Endgame Crisis. Like, Endgame Crisis in general, like, the AI issues, right, to be sure. But we need an endgame. We need something to happen in the endgame that isn't just like the AI gets 3 armies and suddenly, you got this mammoth threat. Because that's never really been that great to deal with in any Total War. Like, you can think about the Huns, you can think about the Mongols, you can think about the Timurids. It's never been interesting when AI just spawns a bunch of doom stacks, especially when they don't have momentum behind that. Or in the sense that they get a bunch of armies at one point, but then they stop, right? It is a bit different with the Mongols, but that with the Huns rather, it is different with the Huns and Attila, but Attila has its own fair share of issues with regards to that. So a better endgame crisis, or just a better endgame in general, would make the game more interesting in longer campaigns. Because when you're starting a campaign right now in Warhammer 3, the most difficult portion of that campaign is going to be the early game, regardless on which difficulty you're playing on, regardless of what kind of endgame crisis you're dealing with. And even things like the ultimate endgame crisis are not really that great to deal with, partly because of AI decisions, but also partly because of the game's performance on the campaign map. So that is certainly an issue that I hope Creative Assembly does decide to deal with. Then we have to talk about automation in a campaign. As you're building a massive empire and you conquer a vast amount of territory, what ends up happening in the game at the moment is that you're having to micromanage every single province. Like going to every province, like, oh, 3 structures finish building this one turn. And I know exactly what I'm going to build even before that turn started. And I'm just having to spend minutes going to province, from province to province to province, building things up. So I think like some kind of province automation would be great. Like let's say, for instance, you have like 30,000 gold income. You could just automate the idea like, okay, I want to build these things across all settlements or these kind of provinces. But just the idea of being able to automate to a degree or another, or fully automate, would be a great system. Not necessarily something you'd want to use at the beginning of a campaign, but something that would make a huge difference later on in a campaign, especially when you have tons of resources and you're just focusing on getting as much money from those provinces as possible and hero capacity. So that would be something. Obviously, it would have to be a comprehensive system to work well. So for instance, you could disable it in certain provinces, but you could select which structures you want to build, or focus on military buildings, or let's say you want structure upgrades to happen automatically. Like that would actually be a pretty big deal. Like let's say, you know, I'm developing a province, I have a certain amount of gold. I'm obviously going to keep upgrading that. Like if I start upgrading the economy, why would I stop? It would just make for a much better system to deal with during the course of a campaign when you're playing Warhammer 3. Because as it currently stands, after a certain point, once you build a massive empire, once you have dozens of regions, dozens of provinces rather, it just gets very tiring having to start one turn after another to just do this all again and again and again and again and again and again. That would be something. So automation of province management would be a pretty big deal, and would really help improve the kind of campaign gameplay we get. Another thing to also mention with respect to this would be automation of leveling heroes and items, and handling items. So when you're starting a campaign, obviously you do have different ways of building heroes. But once you get to a point where you just have dozens of heroes and dozens of armies, and you're recruiting lords and heroes at the fairly high level, it gets really annoying having to every single time just go in the skill line and select all the skills again and again and again, especially when you get like that +3 hero capacity that certain factions, or quite a few factions, have as part of their short campaign victory condition, or their long campaign victory condition of hero recruit rank and lord recruit rank as well. It just gets really annoying and tedious having to do that every single time, like with dozens of heroes, dozens of lords, just having to go through that entire process of picking their skills. Because most of the time, unless you're building an army in a specific way, most of the time, especially with heroes, you're probably going to want to get the same skills anyway, unless you choose to do something different. So having some kind of leveling templates for heroes and lords, even from level 1, would reduce so much of the grind that you do feel during the course of a campaign, especially in the longer term. And then there's also the question of items. Once you get a lot of items, you obviously want to merge them, get blue items, get the stuff you want. that whole system of merging items, like when you have a few items, it's not a big deal, right? Just very, very easy to use that, equip the items you want. But once you're playing a longer campaign and you're looking at potentially hundreds of items, it gets very tedious very damn quickly during the course of a campaign. So some level of automation with that, or significant level of automation. Like personally, I would just want all my items unless I specifically want a lower level item because it has a good effect. But for the most part, I want to merge my items. I want to get those, try and get those armors of destiny or blue items in general. And I don't want green or especially not gray items. There's some exceptions to this because there's some very useful green and even gray items that you don't necessarily want to remove very quickly unless you have the higher level version. But for the most part, that's what you want to do with items. But it is such a very tedious system dealing with item management. There are mods. There is a mod that deals with this. There is a mod that deals with automation of leveling heroes and lords. But it would be great for Creative Assembly to do that. And don't even get me started with the management of ancillaries on lords and heroes, because that's also a huge level of frustration. Like, it's not really a problem, again, when you're starting a campaign. It's not a big issue, but as you're playing the campaign, as you're going through it, and you have a lot of things to manage, it just becomes this kind of situation where you're just constantly handling this. So automation in terms of provinces, in terms of lords, in terms of heroes would be a game changer. And finally, auto-resolve. Especially with settlements, not armies on the field. But here's the problem. The way the auto-resolve works right now in the game is nonsensical. It's based on armor, it's based on leadership. It's not necessarily based on experience, lords, and heroes. Those things do matter, but it does seem that far more often than not, what is very important with regards to the auto-resolve is like, does an army have a high level of leadership? Does an army have a high level of armor? And that creates a really bad situation because you end up having to fight battles you know you are going to win very easily, constantly, especially in the course of a longer campaign. Then, on top of just the field battles being annoying, a lot of field battles being, a joke, there's the bigger problem of sieges and settlement battles. Very few sieges and settlement battles are actually that interesting. Now, that is part of the broader discussion of how sieges and settlement battles don't work very well and how the battle AI handles those. I've made plenty of videos on that. But every single settlement in the game, be a minor settlement or major settlement, does have a significant auto-resolve benefit. Combine this with the inherent downsides of auto-resolves. Like if you have a couple of melee units in a battle, but your army is mostly ranged, those melee units are always going to take a lot of damage, whereas if you fight the battle manually, they wouldn't. Those kind of issues. You do end up in this combination of like every settlement does a lot of damage to any attacking army. And combine that with just the way the regular battle auto-resolve works, you end up in a situation where you're either taking significant casualties for all your armies, regardless of how high level they are, or you're having to fight these battles manually, but they're not interesting. Partly because of sieges, but also partly because a lot of the battles you end up fighting in settlements, like unless there's a full stack in a settlement and a proper army of that, and well-built army or multiple armies, you're going to end up in a kind of situation where you actually have to fight a lot of these kind of battles manually, but they are not really interesting battles because you'll just easily sweep them aside. But you're having to spend minutes of your life going into those battles. Funnily enough, I actually think Pharaoh, again, does this much better. See, in Pharaoh, if you bring a lot of troops, like if you bring a lot of armies, you can easily auto-resolve a lot of battles. Like chariots are the one exception there, like they take a lot of damage, but most of the time when you're auto-resolving settlement battles and sieges in Pharaoh, you can actually win a lot of battles with minimal casualties, and that is a much better system than what we currently have in Total War Warhammer 3. Because it always feels like, regardless of what kind of force you're bringing to bear, that you're always going to take a significant level of damage. There's a whole discussion on the subject of sieges. The reason the auto-resolve works like that with regards to settlements is that the auto-resolve every settlement has an auto-resolve benefit. Basically, they all have like free towers those buildable towers, they're get added for free towards the resolve of every settlement. That's why armies take more damage when they're assaulting a settlement as opposed to doing it manually. Because if you're playing a siege manually, you do your best to not get those towers doing a significant amount of damage, but the auto-resolve doesn't consider that kind of aspect. So those are the kind of things I would hope Creative Assembly does decide to deal with if they're looking to actually improve longer campaigns in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Costine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.